really a delight to have our next three professors join us here to really all three at the cutting edge of research on drivers of disconnection here. I'm going to briefly introduce them, then hand them over, and then we will have a little, I think, some conversation among the panelists that I'll moderate, and then we will have a good bit of time for Q&A. And we'd like to leave that so that we can kind of turn this more into a discussion here. But our first panelist is Dr. Theresa Kuchler. She is an associate professor at NYU's Stern School of Business in the finance group. She conducts research in the areas of household and behavioral and real estate finance and social networks. Recently, Dr. Kuchler has co-authored with Raj Jetty a series of articles on the role of social connection in economic mobility. She's going to, I think, be talking a little bit more about that wonderful new research that I think was published last year in Nature. And after her goes Dr. Tyler VanderWeele. He's the John L. Loeb and Frances Lehman Loeb Professor of Epidemiology in the Departments of Epidemiology and Biostatistics, the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And he is the director of the Human Flourishing Program, where I work, and where several of us and the co-sponsor of this conference, and also the co-director of the Initiative on Health, Spirituality, and Religion here at Harvard. And last, someone known to many of us for a while, Dr. Robert Putnam. He is currently the Malkin Research Professor of Public Policy here at Harvard, I think in the Kennedy School, and the author of numerous high-profile books, including the best-selling Bowling Alone. In 2013, President Barack Obama awarded him the National Humanities Medal, the nation's highest honor for contribution to the humanities, for, quote, deepening our understanding of community in America. His work serves as an inspiration for the documentary film Join or Die, which we'll be screening this evening. So, very excited about this conversation, particularly the conversations we've all had leading up to this. And this is really, thanks in part to the Surgeon General's recent report, we're all becoming more aware of the myriad of factors that are driving the so-called epidemic of loneliness and social isolation. For this panel, we are hoping to provide something like a synoptic account of some of these drivers, but we will be drilling down onto two particularly: the economic disconnections that we have, as well as the social consequences of religious disaffiliation here. And so Dr. Kuchler will start us out with some of her findings, then we'll go to Dr. VanderWeele, who will dive deeper into some of this data on religious disaffiliation and then expand it onto some other factors. And then last, Dr. Putnam will draw these threads together based on his recent work, The Upswing. Our subtitle is How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. So we will, I hope, be ending this and moving this and pivoting towards a more optimistic note. So, Theresa, if you want to come up here, or do you want to do it from there? Just wherever you feel.
Okay, perfect. Thanks so much for having me and allowing me to speak a little bit about our work on social capital and economic mobility. So as economists, but not just as economists, I think one important metric for the opportunity that children have is upward economic mobility. What are the chances of children growing up in low socioeconomic status families later in life? And as you can see on this map, this is something that varies dramatically across the United States. So in some areas, children growing up in relatively poor families as adults earn more than twice as much as in other areas, those same children. And one important question is, what might that be? And so people have long thought and suggested that one important driver of these differences in upward economic mobility might be social capital. And, so you see Robert Putnam here, and he's one of those people who's, has long suggested that. But this research agenda, especially relating it at the granular level to economic mobility, has faced a large obstacle, which is namely measuring these things at a granular level on a large scale, which would then allow us to do systematic analysis. And so this is where our paper comes in. So we use Facebook friendships, anonymized data on Facebook friendships to construct measures of social capital. Based on the prior literature, we divide different social capital measures in roughly 3 concepts. The first one is connectedness. This measures how different people, different types of people, for instance, people of low versus people of high socioeconomic status, are connected to each other. This is also sometimes called bridging capital because it bridges divides along class lines, for instance, within society. The second concept is cohesiveness. And so it measures how strong cliques are, how tight-knit social networks are within a community. And the last one is civic engagement, which you can think of as rates of volunteering or engagement with civic institutions. So we measure those concepts. And let me show you first a map of one of our first concepts, connectedness, and specifically economic connectedness across the US. Looking at that map, you might notice that it looks quite similar to the first map of economic opportunity I showed you. And so if we drill down on a more local level, this is side by side upward mobility as well as economic connectedness for the LA metro area. You can see here that the areas that have high upward mobility are also the same areas that have high economic connectedness, suggesting that these two things might be related to each other. We can formally capture this by comparing all our different measures of social capital to upward economic mobility. And you see here the results, which are the correlation coefficients that tell us how strongly related they are in the data. And what hopefully jumps out to you is really this very strong positive relationship between economic connectedness and upward social mobility. Our other measures of social capital are also somewhat related, but by far not as strong. So it really seems to be that economic connectedness is one of the strongest predictors so far that we have found, even considering other measures that are not constructed by us for predicting upward mobility of children from lower income households. So if you looked at those maps, one concern you might have is that this is masking income. The areas that have higher economic connectedness kind of tend to sometimes also be the ones that are richer. And the question is, are we just measuring income here? So I want to show you this. What we have here, we plot both income as well as economic connectedness. And you see that indeed, these two tend to be loosely positively related. Areas where we have higher incomes on average, we also see more connections between relatively poor and relatively rich individuals. Now, we're going to look at what does this imply for upward social mobility. And we're going to zoom in. Here we see the upward mobility, and you can kind of see that the more blue dots are the ones with high upward mobility. Zooming in on an area with similar income, you see here that for areas that have similar income, it really lines up along how strongly connected are high to low socioeconomic status individuals in terms of determining economic mobility. On the other hand, keeping economic connectedness the same, basically income does not matter at all in relating to upward social mobility, suggesting that it is the connectedness, not something else like income, that is driving these results. So next we wanted to ask, well, if economic connectedness seems to be so important, what is driving this? Why are some areas, why are they more connected economically and some areas are less connected economically? And so first of all, we decompose overall economic connectedness in its two factors. The first is exposure, and the second one is what we call friending bias. Exposure is a necessary force. If high and low socioeconomic status individuals don't share spaces, if they never see each other, if they don't live in the same areas, they don't attend the same schools, they cannot become friends. They cannot have meaningful social connections. But conditional on them spending time in the same places, going to the same schools, connections aren't guaranteed. And so friending bias tells us how likely poor and rich people are to connect as friends, given that they are exposed to each other in a given setting. And so it turns out that if you look at variation in economic connectedness across areas, it's about 50-50. So half of the variation is driven by exposure, where people just don't intermingle in the same groups or settings, but the other half is friending bias, where poor and rich people are not forming connections at the same rate in some areas that they manage to form them in other areas. This depends on the setting. So we studied this by different types of settings where people could be exposed to each other. And what we found is that areas like neighborhoods have relatively high friending bias. People who live in the same neighborhood are not that likely to become friends across class lines compared to many other settings. On the other extreme, we have religious groups such as churches. Churches tend to be very segregated, but conditional on people attending the same church, there's no friending bias. People do form these connections in religious settings. We compile these measures of both exposure and friending bias at the high school as well as the college level. What you see here is you see all the high schools in our sample. And what you can basically see is that you can get high economic connectedness in various ways. You can have high exposure, but also you can have low friending bias. And you get the highest connections if you have both high exposure as well as low friending bias. We see some factors that influence that. For instance, group size. Now, when we see number of students per cohort, we see larger friending bias in larger groups. We see less friending bias in smaller groups. So smaller groups seem to help facilitate interactions between all the members of the group, whereas larger groups tend to more likely split out into cliques, and then they split out by income as well. And this is a concern not just about high schools and colleges. Here you see a few headlines from student newspapers about settings where people have started to recognize that. To recognize that if we want to have connections across class lines, it is not enough to bring people together in the same places. We also need to make sure that they interact, that they initiate, that they find these connections within the same setting, rather than living parallel lives within the same high school or college. And so finally, I want to point out that all this data that I just showed you on graphs is freely available on our website, socialcapital.org. You can play with the data there, but you can also download it if that helps your use case. Our hope is that people across the country can explore both social capital, different aspects of social capital, exposure as well as friending bias in their school, in their neighborhood, in their high school, and think about what is it where we are currently falling short? Are there things that we might be able to do to improve on the aspects that currently are maybe standing in the way of more connections? Thank you.
Well, one might say now it's time for something completely different, but fear not, our third speaker, Dr. Putnam, is going to tie it all together. But I will be speaking on religious community and disaffiliation. I'll be discussing trends, asking the question, do these trends matter? Then what are the causes and what might be done? With regard to the trends themselves, we've seen steep declines in religious identity, especially over the last 15 years. In 2007, roughly 83% of Americans identified with a religious tradition, 78% with Christianity, 5% with other religions. The other religions have remained fairly steady. Christianity has declined. At the same time, we've seen an increase in those either identifying as atheist, agnostic, or no religion in particular, sometimes described as the rise of the nones, N-O-N-E-S. But that has risen from 16% in 2007 to 29% in 2021. Of course, identification is not the same as membership within a community, but here too, we have recently seen fairly substantial declines. Taking a further step back historically, going back to 1940, one sees that membership in a church, synagogue, or mosque remained fairly steady at around 70% or slightly higher for much of the last 80 years. And then starting around 2000 began to once again steeply decline, dropping below 50% for the first time in 2021. As I'll be discussing, rather than identity or membership, what really is most important is participation, service attendance. And so we can look at historical trends there as well. From 1940 to about 2000, this remained fairly steady at around 40%, reporting roughly weekly attendance. There was a bit of a jump during the 50s and 60s, but that 40% statistic had otherwise been fairly steady once again until about 2000. It has now declined to 30 or 31% in the last year or two. So does this really matter? Well, historically, religious community was one of the most common forms of religious participation. And so this matters in some sense in its own right with regard to one of many forms of communal decline. But there's also evidence, rigorous longitudinal studies over time suggesting that participation in religious community was also related to other forms of communal participation and social connection. So those attending weekly were about 60% more likely to report 4 years later or 10 years later greater participation in non-church or religious communities. They were 50% more likely over 10 or 20 years to report regularly seeing friends or relatives, about 30% more likely to go on to get married, about 50% less likely to become divorced, and over 4 or 10 years reporting lower levels of loneliness. So that religious service attendance has been declining has also affected other forms of social connection as well. Secondly, these declines in religious service attendance matter for health, and this has been the topic of much of my own research. Meta-analyses from large, rigorous, longitudinal studies controlling for measures of baseline health, as well as various health behaviors, social and demographic characteristics, have indicated that those regularly attending religious services over, say, a 10-year period have about 27% lower mortality risk and about 33% lower odds of depression. Our own work with the Harvard cohorts here at the Human Flourishing Program have indicated, using cohorts between 50 and 90,000 participants, that likewise, regular weekly religious service attendance is associated over a 15-year period of time with 33% decline in mortality, 29% decline in the odds of depression, and an 84%, sort of a five-fold reduction in the likelihood of suicide over a 16-year period of time. This evidence is further supported by an increasing understanding of the mechanisms, social mechanisms, behavioral mechanisms, psychological mechanisms, by the fact that the magnitude of these associations are quite robust to potential unmeasured confounding by unmeasured factors like personality, and by very clever quasi-experimental studies carried out by economists, likewise suggesting these effects. Importantly, this evidence pertains to religious service attendance, to participation in community, rather than membership or identity or even private practices, which are all more weakly associated. One does find similar effects on health outcomes with other forms of community participation. The effect sizes tend to be somewhat smaller, but are important as well. But it seems to be the coming together of the social and the religious that is giving religious service attendance its powerful effects. Yet further evidence, not just on these outcomes, but numerous others, come from systematic reviews of the evidence recently published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, a book-length comprehensive survey of over 10,000 studies on these topics, and various other studies looking at multiple outcomes simultaneously, all indicating effects not just on mortality, depression, and suicide, but also on greater levels of happiness and life satisfaction, on meaning and purpose, on less substance use, less crime, greater levels of generosity, volunteering, civic engagement, and pro-social behavior, as well as the contribution of these communities to those outside the communities, the provision of soup kitchens, Alcoholics Anonymous services, health screening, medical care, and so on and so forth. Not on all outcomes. There's actually relatively little evidence or evidence for small effects on say, incidence of cardiovascular disease or cancer, on anxiety. And there are more studies that indicate greater weight gain rather than lower weight gain. So perhaps the church potlucks are serving too much fried chicken. But in any case, on a whole host of really important health and well-being outcomes, we've seen important effects of religious service attendance. And these matter for shaping population health. If one were to take our estimate and the effect of religious service attendance on suicide and extrapolate that to the US population, which is an extrapolation, but if one were to do that, it would suggest that of the increase in US suicide rates from 10.5 per 100,000 in 1999 to 13 per 100,000 in 2014, about 40% of that is likely due to the declining religious service attendance. So these trends do matter for health. Thirdly, they arguably matter also for spiritual well-being. The principal ends of religious communities are really not principally health-related or even socially related, but pertain to what these communities themselves understand as spiritual well-being. And so I think these trends would be viewed as both constitutive of and contributing to declines in spiritual well-being as well. So why do we find these trends in disaffiliation? Well, first I'll discuss some empirical longitudinal evidence, and then I'll take a step further back and talk about some of the broader cultural trends as well. One of our studies following 13,000 older adults over 4 years, looking at predictors of ceasing to attend or beginning to attend, indicated that predictors of lower attendance included physical function limitations, hopelessness, and perceived constraints. Factors that predicted greater attendance included better self-rated health, happiness, purpose, having friends, and volunteering. A study of 7,500 young adults, also over 4 years, looking at the predictors of attendance, gave a rather different picture. The dynamics seemed to be quite different. Factors predicting lower levels of service attendance included depression, binge drinking, cigarette use, drug use, number of lifetime sexual partners, non-heterosexual orientation, and insufficient sleep. This study found only one positive predictor, which was getting married. Other studies have indicated both age effects and trend effects. People do tend to become more religious as they age, but that is largely offset by cohort effects. Every subsequent generation has itself been less engaged in religious life. And possibly some of these results from the empirical studies might be partially responsible in explaining the decline of religious participation amongst youth, possibly involving higher depression, changing norms around sexuality, and lower marriage rates as well. But that brings us to broader cultural trends. And a number of factors have been put forward explaining the decline in religious service attendance and religious affiliation, with varying degrees of empirical support or historical or cultural analysis or more speculative. These have included secularism and pluralism, challenging the plausibility of religious beliefs, experiences of suffering or having a sense of being abandoned by God, the sexual abuse scandals within many religious communities and a sense of hypocrisy, a material self-sufficiency, a sense of not needing God or others, an increased desire for autonomy or for freedom from constraints, sexual or gender identity being believed to be in conflict with religious teachings, perhaps less of a desire for or concern with the transcendent, negative media portrayals of religion, falling marriage rates and birth rates, perhaps over-politicalization of religion, with religious groups strongly identifying with religious right, and of course the COVID-19 pandemic as well. I mean, I think the importance of these various factors likely depends on whether what is in view is identity or membership or attendance or beliefs. I think the picture is in fact quite complicated. Also, I think these different factors relate differently to the reasons given versus the actual trends, and may well vary by type of religious community and by age and by race. I think each of them is a part of the story. As to what might be done, I do think we have to be careful here in thinking about potential policy proposals. There is a real danger, I think, in instrumentalizing religion. Most people do not become religious for the purposes of physical health, for example. These beliefs and commitments are shaped more by experiences, upbringing, values, truth claims, evidence, relationships, systems of meaning, and so on and so forth. And I think we might helpfully then distinguish between actions that religious communities themselves might take versus more general societal policy action. With regard to religious communities themselves, there could be attempts for advocating and defending one's beliefs even in the context of pluralistic or secular societies, providing greater resources for those who are suffering, addressing the past and present scandals and abuses. I think trying to structure messaging so as to speak to both or all political parties, appeal to the transcendent and trying to create a thirst for that once again, addressing questions of meaning in life, pointing to the contributions these communities are making to broader society, and also noting the benefits of participation in community life. I think each of these strategies are reasonable for at least religious communities themselves to undertake. I think what can be done at the policy or societal level should be and needs to be more restricted. But even there, I think something like more balanced portrayals of religion within the media, which tend to be negative, might indeed assist. And certainly, many religious institutions do need critique. That is important. But I think that needs to be supplemented by the many positive contributions and benefits as well. I think one might experiment with blue laws, Sunday closures. Once again, I wouldn't propose something like this at a national level, but local communities might consider, would this be of benefit to our community? I think this would also potentially foster other forms of community life as well, and prevent people from needing to work 7 days a week. Tying this to the Surgeon General's report, I would like to conclude with some final thoughts on perhaps a more controversial topic, but one of the recommendations in this report to improve community life was social prescribing. Is this ever, and could this ever be reasonable with regard to religious community? And once again, I certainly think one needs to be careful here. I do not think any sort of universal prescription is at all appropriate. People, once again, do not become religious because of health reasons. However, for those who do already positively self-identify with a religious tradition, but do not participate in a community, that's roughly 40–50% of all Americans, it doesn't seem unreasonable for that group, that subgroup at least, to potentially encourage participation in religious community or in other forms of community life. So I think a sensible, reasonable, ethical approach, even in the context of clinical care, might involve taking a brief spiritual history of 2 questions. Is religion and spirituality important to you? And thinking about health and illness, or at other times, do you have someone, or would you like to have someone to talk to about religious or spiritual matters? Then for those who do positively self-identify with a particular religious tradition, participation in religious community could be encouraged as a meaningful form of social participation. For those who do not identify with a religious tradition, other forms of community life could be encouraged. For those who have had negative experiences with religious communities or past abuse, an offer of referral to a counselor or chaplain could be made. This may seem like a controversial proposal, but I think we can also turn the question around. Given the profound effects of religious community on health and well-being and on social connection, are we doing harm by withholding this information? Thank you.
Over the last 50 years, I've very often been in this building, and I've always wanted to stand where I am standing now. I think that's the preacher in me. I'm in a sense going to try to integrate across all 3 of the presentations we've just heard from Bob and Theresa and Tyler. All of them, their work is extraordinarily important. I won't now go through all the things that I like about their work and the many ways in which it's completely consistent with work that I have done independently. I want to say this now, however, that I'm interested primarily in aggregate change over time, not so much in change in individuals over the life cycle, but change over long periods of time, and indeed very long periods of time. How has America changed over the last, and I'm going to talk about the last 125 years. So in one sense, the view that I'm going to be offering is broader. I'm not going to be looking just at the economic issues we've talked about, or just the religious issues, or just the psychosocial issues we've been talking about, or even just the issues of social capital or social connectedness. I'm also going to be talking about political polarization, which I believe is directly involved here. I'll make the case for that in a minute, and also cultural self-centeredness. So I'm going to be broadening the themes, and I'm going to be lengthening the time. I'm going to be looking at the last 125 years. And I'm going to do that all in 12 minutes, or I'm going to try to get here. We have the next slide, please. So let me start with the historical picture. Over the last, well, now, as of today, I'm talking about right today, and some of this will be familiar to all of you. America has reached historic levels, almost never reached in our history, historic levels of economic inequality. I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and it will relate to the work that Theresa talked about. And almost historically extreme levels of social isolation. Loneliness is one part of that. The measures of social isolation, as we get back into the 125 years, around the turn of the last century, they get a little weaker, but we actually have really good data on membership and involvement in church activity over these periods of time. So I'm going to be trying to make some references to that. What may be it's less familiar from our discussion so far, but familiar to everybody in the room, is America is at historic levels of political polarization. And there are a lot of variables that show that. I'm not going to have a chance to talk with you about all the underlying variables, but there are at least a dozen different measures of political polarization that show with one possible exception. This is the most polarized American politics has ever been, and that exception is the period between 1860 and 1865. I'm not saying that we're now in a civil war, but technically, statistically speaking, that's how extreme our polarization is at the moment. And by the hour, it's getting greater. And finally, and here the measurement issues become more severe, and I'm not going to talk at all about how we've done this measurement. Cultural self-centeredness. Cultural self-centeredness is probably at one of the lowest levels in our history. Much harder to measure, but in the book that Shailin Ramani-Garrett and I wrote, called The Upswing, we made an effort to try to measure cultural self-centeredness over the last 125 or even 150 years, and there's pretty good evidence, you can judge if you read the book, pretty good evidence of this extreme level of self-centeredness now. So that's what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to very quickly just show you some pictures so you know what I'm talking about, but I'm not going to say a word about the underlying methodology. I just couldn't possibly talk about that. If we have the next slide, here is the overall trend in economic equality. The hard data here begin in 1913 because that's when the IRS was created, but we have lots of informal data that show that 1914 was actually not as low as our levels of economic equality. And you can see, I'm going to call attention to 3 points. We were very unequal at the end of the 19th century. It was called the Gilded Age, not for very good reasons, because the gap between the rich folks on the Upper East Side of New York and the poor, struggling immigrants on the Lower East Side of New York was enormously high. And then in the middle of the century, about 1960, you may be surprised to discover that America was the most equal country economically in the world. We were more equal economically, measured by income equality or wealth equality or other measures of equality. We were the most equal country in the world, even than Sweden, an avowedly socialist country and famed for its equality. We were the Sweden. We were outdoing Sweden in that middle of the 20th century. But now we're back down, and again here the data end in I guess 2015, because that's when we finished the book. But the last 8 years have shown yet further, and even the headlines today show that we're getting more and more unequal. So that's the big inverted U curve that we see if we measure economic equality over this period. Now that you understand that, I'm going to be even more quick, and I'm going to talk about 3 more variables. And by the way, economic equality, part of the economic equality here is in fact the equal opportunity for upward mobility that Theresa talked about. Secondly, social cohesion, or what I once upon a time called social capital. I'm trying not to flog my own jargon, so let's call it social cohesion or social connectedness. And again, we have here the trends, measurable trends in social cohesion, social capital from 1890 to 2017. Again, we had to stop the data collection because we had to finish the book, but actually we now know that that trend has continued further down. So it's a huge, another inverted U curve. One graph that fits that, one variable that fits that chart exactly is in fact religious, not just attendance, but religious involvement in, just as we've heard just now from Tyler, the person who spoke with me before. But it's measured in many other ways. And again, I'm not going to try to explain the details that lie behind this curve, but it includes things like social trust, family connectedness, community connectedness, number of friends you have. All of those numbers show exactly the same trend. So I'm summarizing here in this one graph, I'm summarizing 3 or 4, 5, 6 different measures of social connectedness. They all tell the same story. And again, you can see if you start at the beginning, America was very isolated, we don't have measures of psychological loneliness, but we do have measures of the degree to which people were connected to their family and friends and neighbors, and most important, of trust. America was a low trust, disconnected society. in the 1890s. In the middle of the period, in the 1960s, Americans were very connected, high levels of trust, high levels of family connectedness, high levels of involvement in PTA and, yes, bowling leagues. Many, many different forms of connection tell exactly the same story. Americans were really connected with one another in the mid 1960s. But then, just as in the case of economic equality, it turned like on a dime, almost exactly looks like 1960 or 62, we began to go downhill. And year after year after year, we grew less trusting. Our family ties began to fracture. Our involvement in civic organizations like PTA and the Elks Club and so on, those all declined. Trust declined dramatically when at the top here, if you ask Americans, do you trust other people? Just a generic question, do you trust other people? I think the number was something like 70% of us trusted other people, and that's now 25%. So these are enormous changes in social capital, social cohesion. Now, if we have the next slide, I'm going to turn to political polarization. The up here, I'm calling comedy, just as the opposite of polarization. And again, you can see, and I won't begin to tell you all the different measures that lie behind this. This is my home discipline. I'm a political scientist. And all political scientists agree about what this curve, almost all agree. They don't all agree about why it's happened, but they all agree that America had a very polarized tribal political system in the 1890s. But that began, as you can see, early in the 20th century, that began to go up in the late 1950s. In the 1950s, our president then, actually, how many of you ever heard the name Dwight Eisenhower? Oh, you have? Okay, well, Dwight Eisenhower was except for George Washington, Dwight Eisenhower was the least partisan president in American history. He was almost not nominated by both parties. It wasn't that he wasn't the cause of this bipartisanship. He was the consequence of the fact that Americans basically across party lines agreed on a lot of things, and they were quite happy with their kids marrying someone from a different political party, for example. I think 4% of Americans in 1968 said they cared about whether their kids married a Republican or a Democrat. I mean, 4%, right? That's now 70% of people care about whether their son or daughter marries a member of the opposite sex, member of the opposite party. And again, so you can see the same, I won't go through the details, but you can see it's the same inverted U curve. We begin in a very polarized society, and then just about the time that I'm in college and beginning to vote, we suddenly become more polarized. Indeed, all these curves turn just about the time that I first voted. So you might think that's the causal explanation here, that I personally, by voting, caused the collapse of American civilization. Of course, as a social scientist, I take that seriously, but I'm going to explore some other possible explanations for this curve. And finally, I'm going to show you the measures for cultural solidarity. As I say, I wish I could tell you more about exactly how we measure them, because I'm quite proud. You have to read the book to find the details. But basically, this is a measure of the degree to which Americans think we're all in this together, and we should worry about other people, or we're not all in this together. That each of us should be fighting, not only is, but should be fighting for his own self-interest and not worry about anybody else. The devil take the hindmost. And this trend, now it's getting boring, isn't it? This trend shows exactly the same thing. America was a very, very individualistic, selfish society in our morals. If I begin to tell you the data, you'd see I'm not misusing the term selfish. Americans were very self-centered at the end of the 19th century. In the middle of the 20th century, we were extremely willing to worry about other people. And there's a lot of it's hard to believe there's hard data on the fact that we spent a lot of time it's hard now because we're now down at the bottom again. So it's a little hard for many of you to imagine that there was a time, at least in my lifetime, not in the lifetime of most people here, but in my lifetime, in which people actually worried about other people, maybe even more than themselves. Okay, so now you've seen both across time that I was talking about and across multiple variables, not just economics and social capital, but also politics and culture. And you can summarize that all in the next slide. And if you want to hear a lot about longitudinal factor analysis, I'm your guy, because that's what underlies this. But I'm not going to tell you. This just is a damn good summary of these 4 dimensions of American society: economics, social, cultural, political. And now I'm going to just name quickly, and I'm conscious of the time. I'll try to do that. He said 5 minutes, so you can kind of track me. A couple of things I want to say. First of all, most people who look at that chart, their first thought is what happened up in the mid-60s, aside from the fact that Putnam started to vote. But Shannon, Romney, Garrett, and I are not interested in that. First of all, because we don't think that was a perfect period. There were a lot of things that were wrong with America in the middle 1960s. I don't need to tell you about that. It was a racist and homophobic and so on. It was not perfect fight. But more than that, more important than that is what's relevant to us now is not what was happening 100 years ago, 50 years ago when we were, riding high, but what happened to America in a very similar situation to us now. The part of this history that we can learn from is not the top, but the earliest part, because somehow they fixed it. You see what I'm trying to say? They took America that was looking a lot like us, very polarized, very self-centered, very unequal, very, very economically unequal. They took a society like that, and somehow they managed to turn it around. And for 60 or 70 years, we went in the right direction. So the name of our book is The Upswing, because we want to figure out what lessons can we learn from that upswing that will be relevant to us now. And I'm going to try now very briefly to mention 6, but they'll be quick, lessons that I think we can learn from that. First, these are all hard data and they're over time. So the natural thing, at least for an econometrician to do, is to try to figure out what's the leading variable. If you could figure out which variable went first, that might tell you how we could begin to unravel the problem. That is, what is the leading variable? And the natural thing for social scientists and maybe Americans to think about is it's all about economics. So I thought when we did this, well, the leading variable is economics. And we began to get economic inequality under control, and that led to greater solidarity and less polarization and so on. The only thing I can tell you for sure is that is not true. Economics here is a lagging variable. I'm not saying economics is not important. I'm saying if we believe what happened last time, what we're learning is fixing economics is going to be important, but it's not the first thing. It's not the magic bullet. Do you see what I'm trying to say? So if it's not the magic bullet, what is? And here, I shock myself, but I'm also going to shock you, I think, and yet nevertheless fit into the whole kind of religious, spiritual feeling appropriate for this setting. That is, it was moral and cultural renewal, indeed religious revival, that first of all caused this change to happen. And I have to say just briefly a couple of terms just to give you a hint as to what that looked like. At the late 19th century, all across the world, all across America, including in this university most specifically, people were overwhelmed by Darwin's survival of the fittest, and there were social Darwinists who said if it's good enough for animals, it's good enough for us, and therefore the thing we should do to help the race, that's the language they used, is to separate the rich and poor, and to, rather than taking from the rich and giving to the poor, which only encourages them to have more kids, we should take from the poor and give to the rich. Now, it's hard for you to imagine that that doctrine, social Darwinism, was preached in this building. Well, maybe not this building, but preached at Harvard in the 1870s and 1880s. It was how, by the way, Darwin himself never believed that. But that was soon followed by something called the social gospel. And the social gospel was a religious revival beginning with evangelical Protestants, but then quickly moving to all Protestants and Catholics and Jews and across the country. Those theologians initially said essentially, read the damn Sermon on the Mount. He wasn't saying it's great to be rich. He was saying it's harder for a rich man. Jesus was not saying, or God, if you believe that, he was saying it's harder for a rich man to get into heaven than for a camel to get through a vine and needle. He was saying the place of the church, the place of the Christian community is with the poorest, not with the richest. I urge you, I'm not going to recite the whole of the Sermon on the Mount here, but I urge you to read it again. You'll see every sentence in that is saying we have an obligation to help the poor. And that idea, so now I'm coming to the maybe most surprising point of this whole book. We think, Shailene, Robin, Garrett, and I think, we're not calling for religious, specifically religious or evangelical Protestant revival. We are saying we need a moral revival which, like the last time, convinced other people and then all of us that the golden rule, we should care about other people. And now I am preaching from the pulpit here. I don't think we're going to fix any of these problems until that's the first thing. We've got to start caring about other people. I'm just about done. Okay, there's some other quick, in a way, that's the most important lesson that I'm reading today. But I want to get to 4 more points that I think are also important. First of all, the last time we did this, the progressive era, this thing that turned it around. You remember over there in the early teens and in the 1900s and 19-teens, we moved in an upward direction. That was done by young people. Almost everybody who led that movement or participated in the movement was under 30. We think of Jane Addams, who was one of them, as an old lady when she got the Nobel Prize for doing her work in the progressive era, but she got the award for work that she had done when she was in her 20s. And the same thing is true for all those progressive. So my inference from that is it's not going to be people my age, or even the people, most of the people in this room. Old people have the virtue that they have lived through an earlier period. So I can tell you it really did used to be better than this. But I can't tell you what kind of America we need for the 2050s. I don't have any idea. That's up to you people. And so people like Greta Thunberg give me hope. That's what it will. I'm not saying she's going to do it, but that's what it will look like if we start another upswing. It was a bottom-up movement. It was not a top-down movement. It was not the ideas that and the movement that created this period were not done at Harvard or New York or Washington or Stanford, which was just getting started. They were done in flyover country, small towns in flyover country by just ordinary folks who had tried a lot of different ideas, and some of them turned out to be true. So it's small groups, small towns that we're going to see, and that's consistent with some of the things that you've said about small groups, small towns are where it's easiest to hear other people and to try out different ideas. We talked about this in the green room before, that those are the settings in which you get new ideas sparked off. 2 last points that are very important. I wish I had a lot more time to talk about race in this context, because of course that period of the first half of the 20th century we're conditioned to think about as a period of great, not conditioned to think about it was great inequality, racial inequality. And you might think, well, okay, it was only until we got to the 60s that we began to address those questions of racial inequality. Actually, that's historically not quite true, but it is certainly true that I said this is an I society, the we that we created was not diverse enough. And this time, if we have a new upswing, as I'm hoping to trigger, or help trigger, of course, we'll have to be much more attentive to diversity, and especially to race and immigration. Last point, and in some sense, this is the most fundamental point I want to make of all. I've been studying long-term trends basically all of my professional life, long-term trends in social capital and all these things. And you might think, especially if you see this simple curve, well, it's some kind of pendulum. Just wait, it's going to turn around. We might therefore believe in a kind of historical determinism. I don't believe that, and neither should you. It was not inevitable that enough kids got off their duff and began to invent new ideas in the 1910s. It wasn't inevitable. They made a choice. It was an unusual choice because at that time, if you read the language at that time, everybody in America thought we were going to end up in the dustbin of history. They did. It's hard to believe that now because we know what did happen after all. But don't believe for a moment that you can just sit back and somehow all these problems we've been talking about here will fix themselves. They won't unless we get off our duff and fix it. So it's up to you, and I'm pointing especially to the young people sitting in this room. If you don't fix the problems we've all been talking about, they won't get fixed. But if you do, history says you can do it. Thank you very much for your time.
Why don't we have a little bit of discussion here between the three of you, and then we will kind of go forward. I think one of the things that I guess kind of puzzling about with the downturn here is kind of one aspect is this religious variable there, particularly as it relates something to what you said within kind of economic mobility. And I guess I want to invite you, Theresa, to say a little bit more about the low friending bias in those, because it's within the context here of what I think is often referred to as America's most segregated hour of these churches themselves. And so, you know, if we're going to be looking at that as a leading indicator, and we're going to be attending to what Bob Putnam just talked about as a more inclusive we, it feels like a difficult space about how to go there. And that's obviously also related to some aspects that Tyler brought up about the challenges of making this a, you know, kind of an actual policy proposal. So I'd really like to have you kind of talk a little bit more to that, if you could, to start us out. Yeah, it's on.
Okay. It is? Okay. Yeah, that's a good question. And so I think one thing looking at our data to keep in mind is that when you see this friending bias that is very low in churches, what that means is that conditional on people meeting in the same church, they're relatively likely to become friends. What you could not see on this is that this conditional on is incredibly important because churches are some of the most segregated venues and spaces across income in the US. And so basically, yes, in the rare instance that relatively poor and rich people attend the same church, they make these connections. But it's very rare because most churches are either catering to one or the other side of the income spectrum. And so when we make this, you know, when we think about should we encourage more church attendance that I think Tyler's work points to, will that also help increase economic connectedness? Not necessarily, because most people go to churches where they are not exposed to people from a different socioeconomic spectrum. And I think the other thing that we don't know is to what extent friending bias might change when we change the composition of churches. Because ultimately, for friendships to happen and for connections to happen, we need both. We need people to meet in the same spots, and then we need them to connect. In churches, I think we currently do not have the problem that people who meet don't connect, but we have a huge problem that people don't meet others of other socioeconomic status in church. And so churches overall are actually not a huge driver of economic connectedness because they are so segregated.
I just want to say very briefly, I know because of work we've done, that you may be surprised as to which churches in America are like that. That is, they are diverse and they have positive friending bias. They're the evangelical megachurches. We in the Northeast and especially the secular Northeast, don't normally think of that segment, the megachurches and the evangelical megachurches, as being very good for much, but they have the virtue that they do attract people from different walks of life, and they spend a ton of time on getting their friends together, which is a way of their members together, which is we're talking about friendly bias.
Just sticking on this for a moment, I'm sure that many others would have a question on a lot of the other factors here, but Tyler, you gestured towards something I think I've heard you, Bob, say before, that religious community is the most common form of community life there.
Yeah.
I guess, what does that consist of? Do you know about that? Is that the Sunday morning, or is it a lot of the others? And can you tell the difference between attendance at let's say, a worship service versus all the other activities and services that churches will be involved with? I know people who are involved with churches are more likely to volunteer, not just at the church, but, just in general in the community. So.
Yeah, I mean, so in most of these studies, the service attendance is really just self-report. So whether showing up to a group on a Wednesday counts or not, each of the respondents determines that on their own. What is clear from data is the extent of involvement across people does vary quite dramatically. And I think one of the interesting features of some of these associations is that while in the United States, at least, you find these protective associations with health and beneficial associations with well-being across different age, race, ethnicity groups for both men and women, the effect sizes do differ. So it's fairly consistent, although the effects are beneficial for both men and women, the effects are larger for women. And although the effects are beneficial in both white religious communities and Black religious communities, the effects are larger in Black religious communities. And my speculation is that at least some of that has to do with what does weekly service attendance actually involve? Is it just showing up for 1 hour and departing immediately, or is it also being involved in teaching a Sunday school program or going to that church potluck? And I think there are differences in the extent of involvement between men and women, and in white communities versus Black communities, where it's often a much longer, more extensive experience, sometimes involving the better part of the day. So I do think the extent of involvement really does matter. If we really believe it's community, it's social connection, it's the celebration and acting upon those shared values, I think extent is relevant.
We addressed that point a little bit in the book that I and several other people wrote on about 10 years ago about religion and social capital in America. And I'm not going to try to upstage the expert here, but I want to say on this point, we did actually have good evidence. It wasn't the sitting in the pews. It was the church suppers. And so here's a true fact, and its levels of significance, statistical significance, are super great. So I'm not trying to foist on you a little, rounding error thing. If you compare an atheist who nevertheless goes to church suppers, you'll say, well, how would that happen? And the answer is spouses. So you're an atheist, but your spouse drags you to the church suppers. And now we're going to compare you to a completely devoted person. She sits in the pew every day. She believes in God fervently. She's just the most religiously devout person you can imagine, but she does it alone. That is, she sits there. She never connects with other people. The person who is an atheist but connects at church suppers is nicer in all the ways we've been talking about. That is, volunteers more, and this is controlling everything, indeed based on panel studies. So this is a powerful finding. It's being there, actively taking part with the other people in the prayer group or the Havarot or whatever, not your beliefs or even whether you formally show up. It's exactly what you say.
I do certainly think that participation is critical. And I think all of the data points to that. I think the relevance and the consonance of the beliefs may vary by outcome. There's evidence, for example, for mental health, that dissonance between showing up and having a community that believes very different than you may not be protective for the mental health outcome. So it'd be interesting to sort of compare notes, compare data, but I think that piece may well vary by outcome. And everything I presented really is just an average over all people attending, those who believe, those who may not, who may be there by spouses. So there's a lot more nuance that could be provided. And again, these are just averages. And certainly there are others who have had very negative experience in religious communities as well. These findings are not, these results are not for every individual. These are on average over all possible experiences there.
Just one final question before we open it up. I'm wondering, just in that decline, is there a major leading variable of the decline there? I mean, obviously this was from your charts, Bob, but also Tyler and Theresa, please.
Look, just to be statistical for a moment, there's a ton of multilinearity here. Multilinearity is a statistical term for the following. If you go to a shore and you see, gulls flying and they make these big swoops and they're obviously turning, but you want to know who's the leader, and you cannot find it because they all turn at the same time. That's a metaphor for what the statisticians here will know as multilinearity, which means it's really hard to be sure what goes first. But having said that, our reading of all of the evidence is that ideas and morals come first. That's what I was trying to say. That's why it was on the downturn, Ayn Rand was the leading indicator. That is, Ayn Rand, do you even know, raise your hand if you've even heard of Ayn Rand? Oh, I'm so glad that most of you haven't. Ayn Rand was an individualist who wrote several popular novels. I read them when I was in high school, glorifying the individual and castigating groups. She later on influenced people like Paul Ryan and many, many other politicians who thought she's right, the individual matters, it's where libertarianism came from. So both on the upswing, when I talked about the role of the Christian, the social gospel, and on the downturn, ideas were the leading variable. What can I say? It's people who care about ideas, like all of you, who in the long run, as your ideas change, America will change. I'm really quite confident of that, which is why I'm glad you're all here.
Okay, we have one right here in the front, and then there. Got it.
First of all, ooh, that's loud. Hey, first of all, I'm Erin Peavy, and this was amazing and beautiful, and I just want to thank you for your time. You brought up Ayn Rand. I'm an architect that believes deeply in the opposite of all things, individualism, and I'm curious to hear you guys talk about how social infrastructure in our built environments relates to the data that you shared today.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So, when we found these differences in schools and colleges, in both exposure, but also in the friending bias, you see this in the data and you want to know whether that is reflected in what you read anecdotally in real life. And so we digged into some examples. And so some of the examples we actually found, both for schools that had low and very high friending bias, was the built environment. So we found, and in hindsight, this is obvious. We found this example of a Texas school that we saw as having very high friending bias. And so it turned out that this had been a school that was two schools and they had combined it, but they had still two cafeterias. So someone had figured that it would be easier to serve all the reduced and free lunches in one cafeteria and everyone else in the other cafeteria. So now, when I tell you this, you're like, how could you? And they realized that, and they've changed it, and they actually had an architect come in and reconfigure the school to help facilitate these movements and to have to have just students in different classes share space and to meet. And so I do actually think that there's a lot. Just anecdotally, there's a recent PhD student who wrote a paper where he showed that when parks and things like playgrounds were located in the intersection of high and low income neighborhoods, there were more friendships between those neighborhoods. And so I think this really does speak. This is not what our paper focused on, but I think it's something that we definitely came across and that people have built on. And so I do think that that's a really important contributor to many of these connections that we see.
Space is a really powerful determinant. Is it you that I'm speaking of? Yes, a really powerful determinant of social connections and patterns of social connections. And that's true at every level of space. It's true in this room. You are not encouraged to talk to each other. You're encouraged, whereas the right physical space for the ideal physical space for a seminar to discuss this stuff is in my living room, sitting in a circle. So it's true at that level. It's true at the level of buildings. It's true at the level of cities. You can build a city that encourages connection, and you can build a city, as many cities were designed by. I'm thinking back in the 50s, they were designed to kill social connection. And you can think about it, the metropolitan area. That commuting is really bad for social capital. So I think it's one of the most important and widely effective levers that we have. If we choose, we can build rooms, cities, regions that have high social capital, or we can choose to build ones that discourage connections.
I would likewise affirm the importance of built environment, and at a more fundamental level, having a space whatsoever in which to meet. We've done some studies on online religious service participation, and we've found that the size of the effects are tiny compared to the in-person, face-to-face. And while I think it's applicable there, I think it's applicable also in other types of communities, whether you're looking at neighborhood interactions or the workplace. I do think having a space to meet really is critical.
There's a couple of questions back there. Yeah, you can. Sorry.
Hi, my name is E.J. Dion. I want to thank the panels, all of the speakers. I've heard Dr. Waldinger many times, and every time I hear him give a similar talk, I learn new things. And he concluded that getting rich isn't the answer, but Dr. Kuchler, that was an excellent presentation on how social connection can make you rich. And it was just a spectacular use of data. And I want to thank Dr. VanderWeele for giving the first data-driven call for religious revival from that podium. I have to moderate a panel tomorrow on religion and social connection, and I think you increased attendance. But I want to direct my question, if I could, although I'd love anybody to join in, to Bob Putnam, who is dazzling as always. I had the blessing 25 years ago to be invited to a series of seminars that Dr. Putnam organized on what was then he calling social capital. And there were fantastic meetings. They really created social connection. I was actually last night at an awards ceremony for one of the participants in that, and in that seminar. And Sam Pressler, who's in the audience, and I have been talking about a third wave of interest in whatever we want to call it, community building, social connection. And I've been thinking back to the time we did that work and you were doing the seminal work. And it feels like something didn't work out the way we wanted. And there were a lot of people doing this. You were doing your path-breaking work. Amitai Etzioni was sort of leading a kind of new communitarian movement. A lot of people on the, conservatives as well as progressives we're talking about civil society. There was a real upsurge in the 90s in this, and then it kind of went away. And you could talk about a lot of causes of that: 9/11, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the economic collapse, then the pandemic, which may actually be pushing us back to this. I'd love you, if you could, Bob, to reflect on, what worked back then, but why did we have this decline of concern for this, and now this welcome, all the organizers of this conference, and Dr. Murthy and Chris Murphy, there is a revival of interest in this same thing. I'd love you, in the spirit of those great charts, to kind of trace what happened to these ideas over the last 25 years. And again, thank you to everyone for inspiring us in very different ways.
I want to say to everybody else, EJ and I were actually much younger 25 years ago. And EJ was the second most important person in the seminar. Shall I tell them, EJ, who the most important person in the seminar was? It was a young political organizer, black political organizer from Chicago. He later on became rather more famous than either EJ or I. Barack Obama was also in the seminar. Really good question, EJ. I've asked myself that, not just about the seminar, but also about all my work. Remember, I've spent the last 50 years of my work trying to fix America. I know that sounds highfalutin, but that's all I can do. Doing what I can to fix America, and it's gotten worse since I started. And it hasn't gotten any better. So I've worried a lot about that. I do think, with hindsight, that I was insufficiently attentive to the need, first of all, for a moral reawakening, as I've said here. That seminar focused a lot on what particular policy fixes could we do. And some of them looked really good, some of them not so good, but we were focused on, and I now think that those policy fixes are a lagging indicator in the sense that but you're not going to get that unless you have political will, but you're not going to get political will unless ordinary people, think that they have obligations to other people and therefore choose leaders who embody those values. It's a lot less actionable, EJ, because I now think it requires more preaching. That's what you heard me trying to do here. I think it involves convincing a lot of people, especially younger people, don't take for granted what many of your peers believe, which is it's all about you. It isn't. You'll live in a poorer society. You will have a poorer life unless you convince your fellow young people of the truth that we're all in this together and we have to worry about one another. Now, EJ, I don't know whether that's going to turn out to be any more effective. That preaching is going to turn out to be any more effective than the policy things we trigger. I agree with you that, well, I'll put it even more strongly. So far in my professional life, I've been a complete failure. I've done okay from an academic point of view, and book sales have been fine, but that's not the test. That's not the test. You know this. You know me very well, EJ. My whole attitude to life was transformed when I stood at the back of the crowd on the east front of the Capitol on January 20th, 1961, and heard John Kennedy say, with my own ears, the hair on the back of my neck is now rising, ask not what your country could do for you, ask what you can do for your country. I thought he was speaking to me personally. And so in that sense, I've tried, but it's a hard problem.
My name's Gertrude Elena, and thank you for everything you said. What came to mind was education and how education can bridge the gap and how ideas are important. What about religion in schools has the data shown? And does the data reflect the correlation between when religion was taken out of schools and the decline in morality?
It's difficult to find good data on these questions. We've carried out only one study on this, which was comparing public schooling to private schooling to religious schooling to homeschooling. And we actually found on a host of outcomes remarkable similarities across all groups other than homeschooling, which did better. The homeschooling group did better with some outcomes and worse than others. So this is data kind of from 30 years past, so that is not necessarily applicable to the current context, and a lot has changed with public schools, with private schools, with religious schools, and with homeschooling as well. So I'm not sure the relevance of this to the contemporary context, but that's what we found. We found that participation in religious community, and we also found that religious upbringing within the family were the stronger predictors of a whole host of health and well-being outcomes.
Thank you very much. We thank the panelists again for their contribution.